I've been watching America's dietary guidelines the way some people watch the stock market, quietly, obsessively, for years. Every cycle, it's the same ritual: a new document, a refreshed graphic, a few careful tweaks, and a mountain of polite language that somehow manages to say everything and change almost nothing. And then yesterday, something happened that I honestly didn't think I'd ever see. They didn't just adjust the pyramid, they flipped the whole thing upside down. For better or worse, these new dietary guidelines aren't playing the old game anymore. And yes, you can feel RFK Jr.'s fingerprints all over the rollout. Now, before we go any further, let me say this clearly. This is education and commentary, not medical advice. Your body, your labs, your situation, those matter. But if you care about what happens to school lunches, hospital trays, nursing homes, military chow halls, and every institutional kitchen that feeds millions of people a day, you need to understand what this shift really means. Because when federal guidelines change, it's not just a poster in a classroom. It's contracts rewritten, vendors swapped, menus redesigned, warehouses restocked, and entire supply chains forced to adapt, slowly, loudly, and sometimes kicking and screaming. For decades, the foundation of the official guidance was basically a grain empire. Carbs at the base, low fat, low cholesterol, limit saturated fat, count calories, and repeat the mantra, calories in equals calories out, as if the human body is a simple math problem and not a hormonal adaptive machine. The messaging wasn't just nutritional, it was cultural. It shaped cafeterias, dietitian handouts, hospital meal plans, the stuff coaches told you in school, and the guilt people felt for eating a steak like it was a moral failure. But under all of it, there was always a quiet problem. The guidelines kept talking about nutrients, carbs, fat, protein, while rarely confronting what people were actually eating in the modern world. Not carbs, products, boxes, bags, bars, neon cereals, shelf-stable inventions that barely resemble food in any normal kitchen. For a long time, the ultra-processed food companies lived behind a wall of respectful silence because the system was built around them, and now that wall has cracks. The headline in this new shift is blunt: eat real food, not fortified food, not engineered food-like substances with vitamins added back in, real food. And along with that comes something you almost never see stated clearly at this level. Highly processed, ultra-processed foods are being singled out as a central problem driving chronic disease. Obesity, type 2 diabetes, fatty liver, metabolic dysfunction, the whole parade. And here's where it gets really interesting. Even the people writing the rules are still wrestling with definitions. What exactly counts as ultra-processed? Where do you draw the line? And that definitional fight matters more than most people realize, because whoever controls the definition controls the outcome. If food is legally defined as something edible and shelf-stable, then 1,000 Franken products get to wear a health halo they didn't earn. But if food is defined biologically as something that sustains life, supports growth, repair, nourishment, then a lot of what fills carts and cafeterias stops qualifying. And if I had any input, I wouldn't even start by arguing about the definition of ultra-processed. I'd start with the definition of food, not the legal one, the biological one. Because the moment you define food properly, a huge chunk of the modern diet doesn't become less healthy. It stops being food. And that would change everything. Now let's talk about the part that made everyone's eyebrows shoot up: protein. For years, the baseline target was treated like a recommendation when it was really more like a minimum, about 0.8 grams per kilogram. That's how you end up with an average 180-pound person being told that roughly 65 grams per day is fine. But the new direction pushes protein higher, closer to 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram. Do the math on that same 180-pound person, and you're looking at something like 98 to 131 grams per day. That's not a small tweak, that's a new foundation. And it matters because so many people think they're getting enough protein until they count honestly. A little chicken here, a yogurt there, a smoothie that tastes like dessert, and somehow you still land short, especially if you're older, active, trying to manage appetite, trying to stabilize blood sugar, trying to hold on to lean muscle, or trying to stop feeling like you're hungry every 2 hours. Adequate high-quality protein changes satiety, cravings, recovery, hormones, energy, and yes, blood sugar stability. But here's the real-world problem. Guidelines aren't eaten, food is eaten. And right now, the entire system is designed for processed, packaged, predictable, shelf-stable calories. Schools aren't shopping like families. Hospitals aren't picking ingredients like home cooks. These are contracts, pallets, distributors, and logistics built to move cheap, stable products at scale. So when the messaging shifts toward real food and away from heavily processed stuff, it's not just swap this for that. It's refrigeration capacity, prep labor, training, budgeting fights, vendor battles, and political warfare inside procurement committees. That's why this is radical. Not because someone drew a different picture, but because institutional meals, millions of them, suddenly don't match the machine that currently feeds them. And even with all the excitement, there's a big missing piece that keeps haunting every national nutrition conversation: insulin resistance. It's the engine under so much chronic disease, and what's frustrating is that you can improve food quality and still leave people stuck if you ignore a key lever that almost never gets center stage: how often you eat. Because here's the trap. Someone hears real food and upgrades the ingredients, but they still do 3 meals, 2 snacks, and grazing in between. Even if it's healthy, even if it's clean, they keep spiking insulin all day long. They end up with a cleaner version of the same metabolic problem. If your goal is preventing insulin resistance, better foods help. But if your goal is reversing it once it's already there, eating frequency becomes a major factor, and structured meals, reduced snacking, and sometimes time restricted time-restricted eating can matter just as much as the ingredient list. Yet insulin resistance still isn't being treated as the core mechanism in the public guidance, and intermittent fasting still isn't being addressed head-on. And I get why, because admitting insulin resistance is the root issue forces an uncomfortable confession. For decades, the mainstream model encouraged patterns that pushed people toward it. Institutions don't like being publicly wrong. They prefer quiet updates, not apologies. Now, one more point that's going to keep causing debate: saturated fat. Even with the shift toward real food and higher protein, you still see the old ceiling sitting there around that 10% cap. And that creates tension, because if you tell people to eat more high-quality protein but also heavily restrict saturated fat, what fills the gap? Often it's industrial oils, refined carbohydrates, or replacement products that are technically compliant but metabolically messy. To their credit, the broader messaging does push back on refined oils and heavily processed foods, which is good, but it still doesn't educate people on how oxidation and storage matter, or how industrial fats and refined starches creep into everything, including products that wear beige labels and wellness fonts. And speaking of starches, most people understand sugar is a problem, but far fewer recognize its disguised cousins: modified starches, maltodextrin, food starch, refined flour products that behave like sugar in the bloodstream, while letting a package claim it's sugar-free or not that sweet. If this shift is real, the battleground won't just be candy. It'll be the quiet carbs hiding in plain sight inside healthy processed foods. So is this a win? Mostly, yes, because direction matters. Calling out heavily processed foods as a core problem is a cultural shift, not a footnote. Pushing institutions toward real food forces supply chains to adapt. Raising protein targets, whether you agree with the exact numbers or not, changes how people build meals and how hunger, cravings, and muscle health are discussed at a national level. But there will also be chaos, confusion, and a predictable market response where companies try to protein wash ultra-processed junk so it fits the new vibe while missing the entire point. Which means the next few years won't just be about nutrition, they'll be about messaging, definitions, lobbying, and what ends up on actual plates. And I'm genuinely curious where you land on this. Do you see this as a historic correction or a messy overcorrection? Do you think schools and hospitals can realistically move away from ultra-processed foods without blowing budgets and breaking logistics? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And like I promised, I have a free download for you. My personal daily routine checklist, the same framework I use to keep energy high and cravings low and feel younger than I have any right to. The link is below. And since the biggest missing piece in the national conversation is still eating frequency, if you haven't learned how to structure time-restricted eating or intermittent fasting safely, you need to watch the next video, because it walks through the how, the mistakes to avoid, and how to adapt it to real life.